Chapter 11. The Old Woman's Story. My eyes haven't always been bloodshot and red-rimmed, my nose hasn't always touched my chin, and I haven't always been a servant. I am the daughter of Pope Urban X and the Princess of Palestrina. Until the age of 14 I was brought up in a palace so magnificent that all the castles of your German barons couldn't have served as its stable, and one of my dresses was worth more than all the splendor in Westphalia. I grew in beauty, grace, and talent amid pleasures, respect, and hopes. I had already begun to inspire love. My breasts were forming, and what breasts! They were white and firm, and as shapely as those of the Venus de Medici. And what eyes I had, what eyelids, what black eyebrows, what fire shone from my two pupils, dimming the glitter of the stars, as the local poets used to tell me. The women who dressed and undressed me were ecstatic each time they saw me in front and behind, and all men would have loved to be in their place. I was betrothed to a sovereign prince of Massa Carrara. What a prince! He was as handsome as I was beautiful, filled with the sweetness and charm, sparkling with wit and burning with love. I loved him as we always loved the first time, with idolatry and wild passion. Preparations for the wedding were made with unprecedented pomp and splendor. There were constant feasts, tournaments, and comic operas, and all Italy wrote sonnets for me, not one of which was even passable. I was about to reach the peak of my happiness when an old Marchesa, who'd once been my prince's mistress, invited him to her house for chocolate. He died in less than 2 hours, with horrible convulsions. But that's only a trifle. My mother, in despair, though less deeply afflicted than I, decided to leave the tragic scene for a while. She had a beautiful estate near Gaeta. We set out in a galley that was gilded like the altar of St. Peter's in Rome. Suddenly, a Barbary pirate ship bore down on us and boarded us. Our soldiers defended themselves like soldiers of the Pope. They all knelt, threw down their arms, and asked the pirates for absolution in articulo mortis. They were immediately stripped as naked as monkeys, and so were my mother, our ladies-in-waiting, and I. It's amazing how quickly those gentlemen can undress people. But what surprised me even more was that they put their fingers in a place where we women usually allow nothing but the nozzle of an enema. This ceremony seemed very strange to me. That's how we judge everything when we've never been outside our own country before. I soon learned that it was to find out whether we'd hidden any diamonds there. It's a custom that's been observed since time immemorial by all civilized seafaring nations. I later learned that the Knights of Malta never fail to practice it when they capture Turkish men and women. It's a point of international law which has always been complied with. I won't tell you how painful it is for a young princess to be taken off to Morocco as a slave with her mother. You can easily imagine everything we had to suffer on board the pirate ship. My mother was still quite beautiful. Our ladies-in-waiting and even our ordinary maids had more charms than can be found in all of Africa. As for me, I was exquisitely lovely. I was beauty and grace personified, and I was a virgin. Not for long, though. The flower that had been reserved for the handsome prince of Massa Carrara was ravished from me by the pirate captain, a horrible negro who thought he was doing me a great honor. The Princess of Palestrina and I certainly needed all our strength to withstand everything we underwent before we reached Morocco. But I won't dwell on that. Such things are so common that they're not worth talking about. Morocco was swimming in blood when we arrived. There were 50 sons of the Emperor Moulay Ismail, each with his own faction. This produced 50 civil wars of blacks against blacks, blacks against browns, browns against browns, and mulattoes against mulattoes. There was constant slaughter from one end of the empire to the other. We had scarcely landed when some blacks belonging to an enemy faction attacked my pirate captain to take his booty away from him. After the diamonds and gold, we were his most valuable prizes. I witnessed a fight such as you never see in our European climates. Northern peoples aren't hot-blooded enough. Their lust for women isn't as strong as it usually is in Africa. Europeans seem to have milk in their veins, but it's fire and vitriol that flows in the veins of those who live in the Atlas Mountains and the surrounding regions. They fought with the fury of lions, tigers, and snakes of their country to decide who would have us. A Moor seized my mother by the right arm, my captain's lieutenant held her by the left, a Moorish soldier took her by one leg, and one of our pirates gripped the other. Nearly all our women were instantly seized and drawn this way by 4 soldiers. My captain kept me hidden behind him. He had his scimitar in his hand and was killing everyone who faced his rage. Finally I saw my mother and all our Italian women torn and cut to pieces, slaughtered by the monsters who were fighting over them. My fellow captives and those who had captured them, soldiers, sailors, blacks, whites, mulattoes, and finally my captain, were killed, and I lay dying on a heap of corpses. As you know, such scenes took place all over the area 750 miles across, yet no one ever missed the 5 daily prayers prescribed by Mohammed. I freed myself with great difficulty from the tangled mass of bleeding corpses and dragged myself to the shade of a big orange tree on the bank of a nearby stream. I collapsed there, overcome with fear, fatigue, horror, despair, and hunger. My exhausted senses soon sank into an oblivion that was more like fainting than sleeping. I was in that state of weakness and insensibility between life and death when I felt something moving and pressing against my body. I opened my eyes and saw a white man of good appearance who was sighing and muttering between his teeth, "O che sciagura d'essere senza coglioni." Chapter 12. Further Misfortunes of the Old Woman. Astonished and delighted to hear the language of my country, and equally surprised by the words the man was saying, I replied to him that there were greater misfortunes than the one he was complaining of. I gave him a brief account of the horrors I had gone through, then fainted again. He carried me to a nearby house, had me put in bed, and given something to eat, waited on me, comforted me, caressed me, and told me he'd never seen anything so beautiful as I, and that never before had he so keenly regretted the loss of what no one could give back to him. I was born in Naples, he said, where they castrate 2,000 or 3,000 children every year. Some of them die of it, others acquire more beautiful voices than that of any woman. Still others go off to rule states. In my case, the operation was a great success, and I became a musician in the chapel of the Princess of Palestrina. My mother's chapel, I cried. Your mother? He exclaimed, weeping. What, are you that young princess I brought up to the age of 6, and who even then showed promise of becoming as beautiful as you are now? Yes, I am. My mother is only 400 yards from here, cut into quarters and lying under a heap of corpses. I told him everything that had happened to me, and he also related his adventures. He told me how he had been sent to the King of Morocco by a Christian power to make a treaty with that monarch whereby he would be supplied with gunpowder, cannons, and ships to help him wipe out the trade of Christian powers. My mission is accomplished, said the honest eunuch, and I'm going to set sail from Ceuta. I'll take you back to Italy with me. Ma che sciagura d'essere senza coglioni. I thanked him with tears of gratitude in my eyes. Instead of taking me back to Italy, he took me to Algiers and sold me to the Dey of that province. I had scarcely been sold when the plague that swept over Africa, Asia, and Europe broke out violently in Algiers. You've seen earthquakes, madam, but have you ever had the plague? Never, replied the Baroness. If you had, said the old woman, you'd admit that it's much worse than an earthquake. It's very common in Africa. I caught it. Imagine the situation of a pope's daughter, 15 years old, who in the space of 3 months had undergone poverty and slavery, been raped almost every day, seen her mother cut into quarters, experienced hunger and war, and was now dying of the plague in Algiers. I didn't die, however, but my eunuch, the Dey, and nearly the whole harem of Algiers perished. When the first ravages of that terrible plague had passed, the Dey's slaves were sold. A trader bought me and took me to Tunis. He sold me to another trader who sold me in Tripoli. I was sold again in Alexandria, then in Smyrna, then in Constantinople. Finally, I belonged to an aga of the Janissaries, who was soon sent to defend Azov against the besieging Russians. The aga, a very gallant man, took his whole harem with him and lodged us in a little fort on the shore of the Sea of Azov, where we were guarded by 2 Negro eunuchs and 20 soldiers. Prodigious numbers of Russians were killed, but they gave back as much as they took. Azov was burned, and there was a general massacre without regard for sex or age. Only our little fort was left. The enemy tried to starve us out. The 20 Janissaries had sworn never to surrender. The extremities of hunger to which they were reduced forced them to eat our 2 eunuchs for fear of breaking their oath. Several days later they decided to eat the women. There was a very pious and compassionate Moslem chaplain with us. He preached a beautiful sermon to them, in which he persuaded them not to kill us completely. Cut off only 1 buttock from each of these ladies, he said, and you'll have a delicious meal. If you need more, you can have the same amount again in several days. Heaven will be pleased by such a charitable action, and help will be brought to you. He was very eloquent, and he convinced them. We underwent that horrible operation. The chaplain treated us with the same ointment that's used on children who've just been circumcised. We were all nearly dead. Soon after the Janissaries had finished the meal we'd provided, the Russians arrived in flatboats. Not 1 Janissary escaped. The Russians paid no attention to the state we were in. There are French surgeons everywhere. One of them, a very skillful man, took care of us and cured us, and I'll never forget how he made propositions to me as soon as my wounds were healed. He also told us not to be downhearted. He assured us that such things had happened during a number of sieges, and that it was one of the rules of war. As soon as my companions could walk, they were sent to Moscow. I was taken over by a boyar as his share of the spoils. He made me his gardener and gave me 20 lashes a day. 2 years later, he and about 30 other boyars were broken on the wheel as the result of a court intrigue. I took advantage of the incident and escaped, and I crossed all of Russia. For a long time, I was a barmaid in Riga, then in Rostock, Wismar, Leipzig, Kassel, Utrecht, Leiden, The Hague, and Rotterdam. I've grown old in poverty and shame, with only half a behind, always remembering that I'm a pope's daughter. I've wanted to kill myself 100 times, but I still love life. That ridiculous weakness is perhaps one of our most pernicious inclinations. What could be more stupid than to persist in carrying a burden that we constantly want to cast off, to hold our existence in horror yet cling to it nonetheless, to fondle the serpent that devours us until it has eaten our heart. In the countries where fate has led me, and in the inns where I've worked, I've seen vast numbers of people who loathed their lives, but I've seen only 12 who voluntarily put an end to their misery. 3 Negroes, 4 Englishmen, 3 Genevans, and a German professor named Robeck. I finally became a servant in Don Issachar's house. He placed me in your service, fair lady. I became attached to your destiny, and since then I've been more concerned with your adventures than my own. I'd never have even mentioned my misfortunes to you if you hadn't irked me a little, and if it weren't customary to tell stories on board a ship to while away the time. In short, madam, I'm a woman of experience, and I know the world. Just for the sake of amusement, ask each passenger to tell you his story, and if you find a single one who hasn't often cursed his life, who hasn't often told himself he was the most miserable man in the world, you can throw me overboard head first.